Welcome to Mount Royal University's Faculty of Business and Communication Studies 4th Annual International Women's Day event, of which is located in the traditional territories of the Blackfoot and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta. This includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda. The city of Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation. I'm Gabrielle Piska. And today, my colleague Lexi Freehill and I will be speaking virtually with the host of CBC News Network's Canada Tonight, Ginella Massa. Thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So Ginella, my first question for you, you're someone who's now had over a decade of experience in news production and on-air experience. But before that, you were a student at York University and Seneca College, first interning at a newsroom in Toronto. As a female student journalist myself, I've been told many times that the broadcast and radio industry is primarily male-dominated, specifically in the positions of hosts and anchors. So I'm curious to know if you had a similar experience in your time as a student, where you felt these kind of typical gender roles weigh heavily on you, especially at the start of your career.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that is unique to being a woman in the field of broadcast media is there is so much focus on how you look. There's that kind of pressure on women that, our male colleagues don't deal with. I remember reading this story about, a pair of co-anchors. This was in the US, who the female anchor used to get lots of mail and comments about her outfits, and her colleague decided to do an experiment where he would wear the same suit every day for an entire year to see if anyone noticed, and no one ever did. And it was kind of like this little social experiment about how focused and fixated we are on women's appearance in a way that men don't have to worry about. And I have this added layer, of course, of being a hijab wearing woman, but and there's lots of conversation around that, and I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that. But just in general, as women, there is so much focus on how we look, whether it's trying to, cover us up or undress us. In my case, I think sometimes I hear from my colleagues, it's either, as I say, you're either too covered up, or you're not covered up enough, or you're wearing too much makeup, or you're not wearing enough makeup, or your hair is distracting, or whatever, or your hair isn't showing, or whatever it is. There seems to often be this conversation about women's appearance that is really frustrating. I remember one time someone tweeted me because my nail polish was chipped. And I was like, really? Like, what does this have to do with my story or my ability to be a journalist? So that's something that is frustrating as a woman in this industry. People feel entitled, especially when you're in the broadcast world. People feel entitled to share their opinion about how you look. And that can be a little bit frustrating.
Ginella, during your career as a journalist, you've been on both sides of the camera. My question is, can you tell us a little bit about your career today and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah. So as you mentioned, I studied broadcast journalism at Seneca. I had studied communications at York University before that. And I got my first internship at CTV Toronto, which was, a huge an exciting thing for me, but it was also very interesting, to walk into a newsroom in the largest local newsroom in the country, in the most diverse city in the world, and not really see anyone who looked like me. Like, I could count the number of people of color on my hand. And I thought, this isn't really representative of the city that I know, that I grew up in. So I also realized that it was really important for me to be in that space, to offer a perspective that wasn't there, and to be a resource, which I did end up being a resource for my colleagues and my bosses even, who would come to me and ask me things, or try to, get me to help them connect with people in the community that they felt like they didn't have access to, or, were mistrusting of the media. And I realized why it was so important for me to continue on, and fight to be in this industry that is very competitive and very difficult to be in. So I had an internship there that helped, that led to my first job as an editorial assistant. It was an extremely steep learning curve. There were days where I cried in my car because no crying in the newsroom, but I did cry in my car, just because it was really hard and the stakes were really high, being, one of the top newsrooms in the country, and being at the assignment desk. You're kind of the hub where information is coming in and out. You're assigning cameras, you're taking calls, you're setting up stories, and you're a really important part of the newsroom. So there wasn't a lot of room for mistakes, but I was really lucky that I had a manager who saw something in me and was willing to help me learn and teach me. And I was there for 2 years. I went on to be a chase producer at CTV News Channel, a 24-hour news channel. I stayed there for another 2 years. And then I quit without another job. Partially because, my goal was I really wanted to be on air. And I felt like I kind of plateaued in the job that I had. I was doing the best that I could in this job, and there wasn't really a lot of room for me to grow. And I wanted to take on some on-air opportunities, but a lot of times the opportunities that were available to someone like me with no on-air experience were part-time or freelance or a gig here and there, which were difficult for me to take on, especially if they were for a competitor when I had a full-time job at one station. So I had to kind of take that risk and bet on myself a little bit. So I quit and I was freelancing for a little bit so that I could volunteer at Rogers TV, which is like a community cable station, like public access. And then I was freelancing on the side, writing, producing, doing a little bit of media consulting, working on my demo. And I started freelance producing at News Talk 1010, a talk radio station in Toronto. And while I was there, I kind of managed to finesse my way into doing overnight newscasts. So I was doing hourly updates overnight. The schedule was 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. And it was, my first kind of opportunity to be on the radio, and I was still working on my demo. And over that time, I had applied to a job at CTV in Kitchener. And I applied to multiple jobs, but I had particularly this one job where I had applied and I had been rejected a couple of times. And each time I asked for feedback and I asked, what's missing? What can I do? And they said, well, you just don't have enough videography experience. So I went to Rogers and volunteered some more and asked them to give me some videography experience. And I applied again. And finally, maybe they just got tired of saying no to me and they decided to hire me. So that was my first on-air job in 2015. As a video journalist in Kitchener. And I was only there for a year, and an opening came up at City News in Toronto. I applied and I got that job. And I was at City News for 5 years, up until last year where I came to CBC as a national host.
Awesome. That sounds like it involved a bit of fighting, that's for sure. So as an Afro-Latina Muslim woman, did you find you had to fight harder for opportunities to be behind the camera or in front of it? And what tips do you have around how to best self-advocate?
Yeah, as I mentioned, a lot of times I was in spaces where no one like me had ever been. And a lot of times people would look at me and wonder, oh, who's this girl? And, I was young and I remember being in the radio station and people being like, oh, are you the intern? And I was like, no, I'm the producer. So often people underestimating or having an idea of, who might hold those positions and being surprised when it was someone who looked like me. I think that the biggest hurdle was trying to get on air because, I was the first woman in hijab to ever be on air as a television reporter. And as I said, I applied for that job and I got rejected a couple of times. And I had to be the one to kind of address the elephant in the room and say, hey, listen, I know it might feel like it's a risk hiring someone like me. It's never been done. And, I want to make sure that we can have an open conversation in case you have any apprehensions or concerns about what limitations, might exist for me, which most of the time there weren't any, but there were assumptions that there might be. So I had to be the one to kind of open the door to that conversation because often hiring managers were afraid, they didn't want to come off as, racist or they were discriminating against me, but they did have questions that they were afraid to ask. So I had to say, hey, let's have an open conversation. Let's have a dialogue. And I think that helped me trying to, get my foot in the door. I certainly never had anyone flat out say to my face, you will not be hired because you wear hijab. But I know that it was a question that was in some people's mind about whether, Canada, how would viewers respond? Or, there's always this question about bias and objectivity. But I do know that it was a feeling that people had. I learned many years later after graduating that one of my professors had approached a friend, a colleague, a classmate of mine and said, would you talk to Ginella? I think she's really good and she's really talented. She's going to go far in this industry, but I worry that she'll have a hard time because of her hijab. And I wonder if she would ever consider removing it. But she didn't have that conversation with me. She obviously knew that it wouldn't be a good look, and maybe I would accuse her of like discrimination or something. And so she tried to like talk to my friend to like talk to me about it, and my friend was like horrified and was like, absolutely not, and didn't tell me about it until like years later when I was already working in news. So certainly this is something that I think that was on people's minds. I had a producer tell me when I was also working as a producer, rather an on-air host, tell me. I was talking to him about a friend of mine who had been hired, and she was Muslim. And he said, oh, does she wear hijab? And I said, no. And he said, yeah, they'll never put a woman in hijab on TV. It's too distracting. And he said it so flippantly, not knowing that was something that I was, striving to do. And, I didn't say anything in the moment, but it did feel like kind of a punch in the gut. And I just, in my mind said, like, we'll see. Hopefully I can prove him wrong. So yeah, it's almost harder sometimes to combat something that's not in your face, because but at the same time, it allowed me to kind of say, maybe it's just me, maybe it's just in my head, and and to convince myself that the only person who was going to stop me was me. So it was good and bad that I didn't deal with blatant discrimination from hiring managers, but I know that it was certainly a hurdle that I had to overcome.
And as someone with so much experience who has seen firsthand the way gender inequities can play out in broadcast media, I wonder, what would you suggest are some of the most important ways that gender equity can be advanced in newsrooms?
Yeah, I mean, I talked a little bit about some of the things that women obviously have to deal with when it comes to the way that they are judged and perceived for how they dress and how they look. One of the other things that I had thought about too was not so much what women thinking about my job as a video journalist, right? I was someone who was out on my own, shooting my own stories, and thinking about the ways in which I may be in situations that are not safe for me as a young woman who is 5'1", like, but not feeling like I could speak up and say, hey, I feel like this might be dangerous, or I don't feel safe being out on my own, because then you'll be perceived as weaker or not able to do the story or whatever it is. But recognizing that, women are in a different situation from men, that they are more vulnerable, more susceptible to, strangers and people, or especially now in this era of people, there being a lot of sort of hostility towards journalists. Recognizing that some of us may be in positions that are where we're more vulnerable to that. And so how are we making sure that women feel safe, and not just in person, but even online? Women are often the ones who are under attack in terms of gendered violence, in the sense that, the types of vile messages that we often receive are very specific to the fact that we are women, right? Like rape and death threats and things like that. So, recognizing that we face different challenges, we face different, threats than our male colleagues. And just by being women, people perceive us as being, vulnerable, or being a target in a way that, our male colleagues may not. So kind of understanding that difference is important, and giving us the tools and the ability to deal with that.
Now, kind of looking at the other side of it as well, what about in terms of how diverse stories are presented by major media outlets, kind of looking at that external factor?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly something that it's a fight that I've been having since my career started, often feeling frustrated, like the bar would move when stories would be pitched around race. So a couple of different reactions would happen. Sometimes it would be that there wasn't an interest, or there wasn't an appetite for these kinds of stories, or like it's too niche or specific to a type of group that no one would be interested in, and it's not going to generate clicks. So there is that. And as I said, I've worked mostly in and around Toronto. So recognizing that Toronto is a very diverse city. And so that is a false notion that people would not be interested in these stories. The other piece was around stories around racism and discrimination. We would get told things like, well, it's he said, she said, we can't prove it. Are police investigating? And so the bar, as I said, would always be set higher as to what what makes a story legitimate or not, when we would do other stories with way less information, relying on people's personal experiences and not questioning them as credible in the same way that we would when we did stories around race. So, I think that's something that we're starting to really start to unpack, especially in the wake of George Floyd. I think there is more of an appetite to tell these stories and hear them, not because they weren't happening before, but because people are now speaking up about them, and people actually are able to present tangible evidence in a way that we haven't before. So I think it's really important to continue to tell these stories, because we have to be reflective of the communities that we're reporting on. These are things that are happening in our communities. Yes, maybe to one population, but they are an important part of our society. So we should be telling their stories as well.
So many students, myself included, struggle as they enter the workplace to know how best to support and actively work to protect and advance the rights and visibility of marginalized groups. You have been a leader in the community on this front. So I'm curious, how do you define allyship?
Yeah, it's so interesting. I actually said in an article recently that I kind of hated the word allyship, or the concept of it, because it positions racism as my problem that you are going to help me with, when I'm the victim of the racism, and folks who often belong to the communities who are doing the racism are then asking, how can I help? So to me, as I said, it frames it as my problem that I'm supposed to solve and you're going to help me with. And that, I think, is already the premise that we're starting from is problematic, right? So seeing it as an issue that is, especially if we're talking about white people or people who belong to sort of a dominant society or demographic, right? Seeing it as your problem, seeing it as something that you are complicit in by standing by, right? And there's often this notion of not saying, it's not enough to be non-racist, you have to be actively anti-racist. And that, to me, is what that means, right? Recognizing that by not saying something, by not speaking up, or by standing by and standing silent, often that in and of itself is damaging. So how do you use your position or your privilege to make space for people to amplify what they're saying, to echo their concerns, and open the door for them to have a seat at the table in the same way that you might. So a simple example of this is, I often would be in those pitch meetings where I would maybe be pitching one of those stories that I'm talking about, and a manager or whatever is saying, oh, there's not much interest or whatever. And I would leave the meeting, and then a white colleague would come by and say, oh, I think you were right. I think we should do that story. But they would say it to me privately, instead of speaking up in the meeting and saying, hey, actually, I think this is an important story that we should do. So that was frustrating to me, where I say, okay, well, use your position or use your privilege to amplify something that I said, rather than coming to me on the side and saying, oh, I support you quietly and privately, but not publicly, or in front of a manager or in front of a room. So, these are simple and small ways that we can speak up for people and do the work ourselves, rather than relying and asking other people to solve the problem. It's like asking a woman who is being abused, what can we do to make sure that you're not being abused by your husband, right? When the person that we should be engaging is the person who is doing the abusing.
And why is it still necessary to continue to call for diversity and equity, even when you yourself have begun to break through the glass ceiling?
Yeah, I mean, I've been fighting for representation in newsrooms since, as I said, since the moment I walked into my first internship, because I recognize that it's important, not just in front of the camera, but behind it as well. Because, this idea that journalism is objective and impartial is actually completely untrue. Every person who comes into a newsroom and who pitches a story and who writes a story has their own biases and ideas and opinions of the world that were shaped by our experiences. That's just reality. We are human. So the more people we can bring into a newsroom who have different experiences, who have different ideas, who view the world in different ways, the more we can all be in the newsroom to challenge each other, to talk about what are the stories that are important to us and how do we frame them and whose voices do we include. When those are more representative of the society that we are serving, because I do see journalism as a public service, as a public good, especially working for the public broadcaster, then that's how we can start to actually reflect a society that we're working for, is ensuring the people who make the decisions about what stories are told and how they're told actually belong to different communities. And that's not just racial diversity. That's also, looking at people from different genders, sexual orientation, different classes, different ages, right? What's a story that's interesting to someone in their 20s is going to be different than a story that's interesting to someone in their 50s. So that's why we need to make sure that our newsrooms are actually made up of the demographics that we're serving.
Now, I know that in other interviews and conferences you've mentioned, and you mentioned it a little bit earlier today too, that as a student and during your career progression, you didn't see anyone who looked like you that you could go to for advice, or even mentors who had the same experiences that you did. What advice would you give to students who may be feeling discouraged or nervous about joining the news industry due to this lack of inclusivity?
I mean, I think it's changing. And I think that now people are easier to connect with, even just Twitter and Instagram and social media is very different now than it was when I started the industry, 12 now years ago. And so it's easier for me now to connect with people and to reach out to them and to make networks and find, people who I can go to and vent a little bit and get some advice. And so, we're there. We are there. We do exist. And the internet makes the world a little bit smaller. So, don't be afraid in that sense. But at the same time, that's exactly why you're needed. Right? If you feel like people like you aren't represented, whether it's, people with disabilities, people with, neurodivergent, backgrounds, and or people from, I was having a conversation with someone who said, I don't see any, Sikh broadcasters who wear turbans, or, whatever it is. If you feel like you're not represented, that's exactly why you need to be there. Right. So, don't be afraid. It is a difficult and daunting task sometimes to be the only one in the room who looks like you, and you're representing an entire community and feeling like you're carrying that burden on your back. But it's so important. And for me, I don't want to be just the first and the only and the last. I hope that I'm the first of many, and it can encourage others behind me.
And in terms of providing additional advice, what guidance would you give to recent grads who are looking for ways to engage in meaningful allyship in their workplaces?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of allyship, as I said again, often the best thing you can do is think about how people who have had a completely different experience than you might experience a story, right? And this is what we always strive to do when we talk about being like objective journalists, is like looking at a story from both sides, but not just from both sides, but looking at a story from different sides, from a different perspective than yours. And making sure to include those voices in those stories, right? So thinking about, how might someone who has a different perspective than me view this story, and let me hear what they have to say about this. Let me, include that voice. And I always struggle with this as well, is in terms of stories that are specific to a community, and whether or not the person who belongs to that community should be the one telling that story. Because sometimes it can be more exhausting to feel like I have to do this and I have to do it right. But as journalists, we should be able to tell stories from all sorts of different topics, right? I use this example. I don't like to cover sports, but sometimes it's my job to go to the, season home opener, and there are people who are really passionate about this. So how do I ensure that I do this story justice, right? If it's not something that I personally care about. So what would I do? I would go and seek out sports fans who are really passionate about this topic and hear from them, right? So how do I apply that same lens to, say, a story about racial inequality or whatever, when I'm not a person of color? How do I ensure that I do that story justice to the people who really care about this story when I personally am not impacted by it, right? So it should, as I kind of going back to the point about it shouldn't just being, oh, this is a story about racism, so I'm going to assign it to the Black reporter. How do we ensure that everyone can do these stories and do them well?
And I just have a quick follow-up question. You mentioned that you kind of hate the word allyship. So what word would you use?
I don't know that I have an alternative for it. I don't Yeah, I mean, I think that it is the word that we have. We say you want to be a good ally, so it's fine if you want to use it. But I think it's more about reshaping our understanding of allyship and the premise around it, right? Because, as I said, it positions white people as the helpers of dealing with racism, and I don't know, and I feel like they should be the ones leading the charge.
Yeah, that makes sense, and the way you word it rings definitely true. So on behalf of myself, Gabrielle, and Mount Royal University's Faculty of Business and Communication Studies, I would like to thank you, Ginella, for joining us in marking International Women's Day and celebrating women in the workplace.